In this interview, we talked with Kevin, a California native who, in his own words, went from an almond milk latte drinking millennial liberal who viewed Donald Trump's 2016 election as a catastrophe to America to someone who voted for him in 2020. As for what caused that drastic change, he cites his 4 years' experience living in China. So why did learning about China change his views on US politics? And as a Mandarin speaker and reader, what did he learn about how Chinese people look at America? We also talked about whether China is actually a socialist society by definition, the Chinese people's obsession over money, and how to stay rational and less biased in this polarized world. But it wasn't an interest in politics or current affairs that landed him in China. At first, it was just to achieve a goal as a language lover.
Really just putting that sort of the wheels in motion around one of my goals, dreams, I don't know what you want to call it, which was to learn to speak Mandarin by the time I turned 30. And so, shortly after my 29th birthday in early 2017, I moved to Beijing and spent about 6 months studying at Beijing Language and Culture University there, and then ended up getting rehired by the company that I left to live and work in China for them.
So he ended up in Shanghai, working and learning about the country. Then the pandemic broke out, and China's rigid lockdown followed.
It was pretty scary.
At the time, streets in Shanghai were almost completely empty. Authoritarian governments control every aspect of public and private life and are able to do things that are less likely in free societies.
And to be able to mobilize like thousands of people to walk around neighborhoods on loudspeakers telling you to stay inside and to not go outdoors.
Western media has been praising China's success in controlling the virus. That's despite experts, leaked documents, and interviews with frontline medical workers that suggest the regime is severely underreporting its virus figures.
We had found out that there was a new rule passed down from the neighborhood committee that all gates were to remain locked from 10 p.m. to 8 a.m. And so we were asking the security guard, like, what's the deal here? Can we go out to walk our dog? Like, nope, you're stuck here till the morning. Like, well, you're here, you're still awake, you can unlock it, right? Nope, can't unlock it, I don't have the key. So the security guard didn't have the key. And it's like, think about if you had an actual emergency and you needed to get to the hospital, like it'd be maybe a couple of hours before you could get out of your lane. And just the idea that you can be locked into your home, and you can't leave. And people want to praise that as success of China's controlling the pandemic without considering the context of what that would mean. I mean, personally, I would not trade the freedom to go outside, the freedom to protest, the freedom to speak online. I wouldn't trade any of that. The coronavirus will pass. And, as we've seen from, let's say, Bush-era legislation, Patriot Act, things like that, once the government gains powers, they're not so easy to give them up. I think it's a trade-off that's not worth it, and one that I would never advocate making. Yeah, I mean, the first thing to know about China is that the modern system isn't remotely socialist. The modern system isn't remotely socialist. The modern system in China is kind of capitalistic to an extreme, in the sense that there's not a great safety net. One thing I think Westerners generally don't know about is the hukou system, which basically prevents people from outside of a given city moving there and then accessing social services there. So if you move from the countryside where you're very poor and you're making $200 a month to a situation where you can go work in Beijing and maybe make $800 a month working kind of at the lowest rung on the career or societal ladder sort of thing, you're not going to have any access to services there. So your kids won't be able to go to school there. You're not going to be able to access the medical system there. So if you want to send your kids there, you have to buy a house in Beijing, which, given that the cost of a small house in Beijing is something like, $1.5 million or $1 million. Like, for people that are making that kind of money, it's just an absolutely impossible goal. So it's very capitalistic now without a lot of the social safety net kind of things that we would consider to be more socialistic in the US. Like, when we talk about socialism in the US, generally people have some kind of version of Northern Europe in their minds, where education is paid for, where higher education is paid for, where you have, maybe a year of maternity leave. I think that's what people think of when they think of socialistic kind of policies, and China actually has very, very little of that. Something that kind of struck me as an interesting irony when I was living in Beijing and kind of taking that all in, and was that if you go to Tiananmen Square, across from Tiananmen Square, where they have the Forbidden City, at the entrance to Forbidden City, there's a giant portrait of Chairman Mao. Chairman Mao, who symbolizes the socialist revolution in China. And the fact that Chairman Mao is on the 1, the 5, the 10, the 20, the 50, and the 100 RMB bill. Not like in the States or some other countries where you have a different person on every one. He is on every single one. And I think it's this kind of, 带着社会主义的帽子. So it's like dressing itself up as socialism in certain ways by paying homage to this great figure, Chairman Mao. But in reality, modern day China would be unrecognizable to him. And like when I was taking taxis to and from school in Beijing, and that was kind of fun because Beijing taxi drivers have seen a lot. They've talked to a lot of people. A lot of them have been there for 30, 40, 50 years, and they've seen the city go from being, very much the capital city of a third world country to being one of the most developed cities in the world. And the thing they miss most, it seems, was, back in, let's say, the 70s or 80s, you might be working at a company, and the owner of the company or the boss of the company might be making 3 times more money than you did. But now the owner of the company is making 3,000 times more than the person at the bottom of the company. And so that was just something that they kind of the abandonment of those principles, which isn't to say that, I'm an advocate for what, Mao wanted to do, because I don't think it's realistic. I don't think it's realistic. If people don't have to work, if they don't have to compete, we haven't seen that succeed anywhere. It usually ends in famine and bloodshed. So another thing was just the talk of how people had become obsessed with only money. I remember I took a Chinese film class in college, probably 2009 or 2010, with a professor who went on. He's a pretty famous professor in terms of like the Chinese cinema world. I remember a line that he said, which was, in China when I was there and nowadays, it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter if you're an English professor or a Chinese history professor or a mathematics professor or an engineer. Like when they get together in the school cafeteria to have a conversation, it never took more than 2 minutes for the conversation to turn into who's buying what real estate and where they should buy their next house, because this price of houses was skyrocketing. So just kind of the obsession from, I got to be careful about how I say this, I suppose, but I can't say that there's been a shift because I wasn't there before, but based on descriptions that I've heard from people of older generation in China, modern day China has become obsessed with money and only money. And, it kind of goes back to what Deng Xiaoping said, who was responsible for reform and opening up in China, which was, doesn't matter if it's a black cat or a white cat, as long as it catches mice, it's a good cat. And so the notion there, the metaphor there was, doesn't matter how you make your money, as long as you're making money, you're doing a virtuous thing. And I think there's definitely much, much more of that sentiment, that mindset in China today than there is anything akin to developing a socialist society that's going to take care of everybody. Maybe the most shocking thing to me was learning how most people view America. And I know anytime you say most people, like there's going to be people who say like, oh, you're an idiot, Kevin, you don't understand China. They're like, of course that's true. It's a country with 1.3 to 1.4 billion people. Like to say that I'm going to be able to encapsulate what everybody thinks in one sentence is just absurd, and that's not what I'm trying to do. But generally speaking, the anti-American sentiment in China was very, very shocking to me. For one, the U.S. leaders, in terms of what they present to the American public, there's never this notion that China's our best friend and that we're going to go marching happily off into the future holding hands together. There's just like not that kind of image. But there's definitely not anything close, anything remotely close, anything 1,000 miles away from the amount of anti-China sentiment in America that there is anti-American sentiment in China. And I don't mean anti-American in the sense of me as an American, I felt unsafe or unlike there. It was more of, imperialist America, 美帝国主义, this notion that had been kind of beaten into people's minds from the 1950s, that America was at that time and, is still and will remain into the future the single most destructive force to the future of China's development, and it is our mission in life to overcome America. You know, there's like a saying, I don't know when the saying came from, but it's like 赶赢超美, catching up with the UK and overtaking America. So there's just that sort of, there's a lot of references to that kind of ideological, economic, system of nations kind of struggle that's embedded within everyday discourse in China that just simply doesn't exist in the US. You know, to an extent, I think their fear is justified, or their anger is justified, because, you know, you have people like me who, if you ask me frankly, I don't want to see China become the guiding force on the international stage. And it's not because I have something against Chinese people, and it's not because I don't, you know, it's not because any of those things. It's not because of Chinese culture or any of that. It's because the principles that the government in power of China right now uses, the levers of power that they pull, are going to create a world that I don't think most of us want to live in. So a world where you can't criticize your government, whether it's local or state or federal. I mean, that's the system that you have right now. That is the system that you have right now. And every now and then in China, there's a show trial of a corrupt official, and they, you know, put him in jail for 20 years, or he gets the death penalty for stealing a bunch of money from the public. But that's a show trial. The purpose is to give the laobaixing, the people of the country, a little bit of red meat, so they can say, oh, look, you know, they're taking on corruption here. But they're not doing anything to the other 99% of the officials there. And, you know, basically any time there's bad news in the U.S., whether it's a shooting here or you know, some accident that kills some people, there's always going to be some sort of people online leaving comments like, oh, that's too bad, only 3 people died. You know, like it would be better if there were more Americans that died in this shooting or this accident kind of thing. And obviously that doesn't represent a lot of people, but like, you just think about that kind of comment. Like if somebody left a comment like that on YouTube after an earthquake in China killed some number of people, and some white American left a comment saying like, oh, I wish more people had died because China's evil or whatever. Like, you would have 50,000 people, rightly so, calling that person a racist, disgusting monster, and they should get offline and never get online again. Whereas like in China, sometimes that kind of comment can be the most upvoted comment. So this kind of anti-American sentiment, again, not against me as the person. Like, for the most part, until the pandemic broke out, I felt very welcome wherever I went in China. And that's one of the things that I loved about it, just everybody's curiosity for talking with somebody from who's literally from another world than them. You know, a lot of it has to do with education. As long as you grew up after 1949, what you learned in school was, you know, it wasn't just America, it was Meiji, like American imperialism. And then a lot of it has to do with the information environment as well. Yeah, there's been a rise of the Meiji, like I guess individual media platforms or individual media contributors in China, the same way that there's been a rise of YouTubers and things in the US. But the Meiji is also like that the character that means, you know, self or controlled by self, like, is actually really inaccurate, because the Meiji is also completely controlled by the government, and the platforms that the government regulates. So WeChat and Weibo and Bilibili and things like that. So people only are able to talk about topics that are approved. And so if you're a Chinese citizen, if all you're seeing are things that are accessible within China without a VPN, then everything you're seeing is curated. Nothing is going to be published that isn't in step with like the overall narrative. And if it is published, it's going to be deleted very quickly. You know, one thing that struck me as really crazy was in 2017, an article written by kind of one of these individual media people that became super, super, super famous in like a matter of days, and then was like immediately scrubbed from the internet. Like, you couldn't share it on WeChat, or you couldn't share it on Weibo, the Chinese version of Twitter, anymore. And the article was like pretty harmless. It was an article called "There's 30 million people pretending to live in Beijing." Like, Beijing有3000万人在假装生活. And so basically the article just talked about how life in Beijing, unless you were somebody who was from the city and had family roots in that city, and because of that you had bought in property, you know, if you're not one of those people and you're in that city, like, you're probably living an hour and a half away from where you work. You're probably sitting on the subway, you know, with 400 other people in a subway car with no breathing room for that 3 hours each day round trip. You're probably working 12 hours a day. You're probably barely making enough to pay your mortgage. You're probably not eating out because like you don't have the excess income to do so. And to buy your house in the first place, you probably got, all of your money, all of your wife's money, your parents' money and her parents' money, and maybe some of your grandparents' money. So you got like 6 or 8 wallets together to buy a house. And so this is just an article talking about like kind of the drudgery of living in Beijing for most people. And so this is just kind of social commentary. And within a couple of days, it was like scrubbed from the internet. And so why do people think the way they do? It's like, well, when a critique is harmless as the quality of life in Beijing and like just pointing out facts that are very obvious to most people living there, when even an article like that can be censored, you just have to understand that you're not reading anything that hasn't been selected for you. Yeah, like if people in this country could understand and had the patience to sit through the nightly news broadcast for a month in China, like you would have 100% of people agreeing with what Donald Trump said, which was that China doesn't like us. China does not like a future where America is like the prime power. Like you wouldn't have any disagreement with that statement. And he probably wouldn't even have got elected in the first place because like going into allowing China to come into the WTO in the 2000s, which, wiped out like tons of American jobs. Like that never would have happened in the first place either, because people would have been like, what are you thinking? Like this is a country that does not like the existence of America as it is today. Why are we going to give them power? Why are we going to give them a route to making more money so that they can take more of our manufacturing capacity and move it overseas? Like, why would we ever do that? Yeah, I mean, the only reason Trump got elected is because of China and because of the relationship that the U.S. and China have come to develop. And the only reason that relationship exists is because, like you said, people in this country, all they see is the Dawaishan, all they see is the outward propaganda. They never see the inward facing propaganda. But like, yeah, I mean, I remember driving around Beijing just one night and there's a billboard all lit up, like one of those digital kind of billboards on the side of the road on Arhuan, so like one of the most central in the city. And it's just like an advertisement for the military. And like, they're at war, and it's like we are ready to fight the war, and it's like it was just very, very tangible. I remember that ad being like very, very tangible. It wasn't like, I don't know, join up for like an adventure kind of thing. It's like there's a war coming and we need you to be ready to fight it. And it's like that's kind of the mindset, the populace in China sees themselves engaged in an ideological struggle in the U.S. Like people here haven't nearly caught up to that. I've been a left-leaning voter ever since I was eligible to vote. I guess it's 13. How old am I? Oh my God. So that was 15 years ago. Oh my God. 15 years ago. So ever since I've been eligible to vote 15 years ago, I've been left-leaning. I grew up in Los Angeles. I went to like a very sort of inclusive private school here that talked a lot about diversity and equity, equality, and things like that. And in 2016, I was absolutely appalled at the idea that Donald Trump could win the presidency. Like, just thought that him winning that was the greatest scar on, America's reputation that could ever possibly happen, and it would be there forever, and we would be forever known as like a country of idiots. And like my greatest fear when Trump came into office was that his kind of anti-immigrant America first sort of rhetoric was going to turn people off from wanting to come here. Because the greatest thing that America has going for it is the fact that the best and brightest people from every country in the world basically list America as the first place that they want to come and pursue their goals. And so, like, no foreigners, no Google, basically. But if you've worked in that environment, you know that like people that work in, whether it's biotech or whether it's tech, a lot of them have immigrated here. And the fact that we're able to maintain that kind of supremacy in those industries is without any doubt in my mind, because we have the best and the brightest people wanting to come here. When he came into office, I was just, it blew my mind. It was completely insane. Like, this person's an idiot. He's blusterous. Like, he just talks smack about people 24 hours a day. Like, this person who tweets stupid stuff online every day. How could he possibly be elected to represent America? It was mind blowing to me. My sort of gateway into not out of pocket disavowing everything that he said. I mean, I guess that's kind of like, if you're on Team Red in America, everything every Republican politician says is true, and everything every Democrat politician says is lies and propaganda. And if you're on Team Blue, the exact opposite is true. And so I think for a lot of people, myself included, up till 2016, that's how I viewed things. But until let's say 2017, when I had gone to China and started to experience life there, that was my thinking towards Donald Trump, that everything that he said was a lie and nonsense, and that he was going to be the end of America as we knew it. And I don't think that was true. But seeing specifically his stance on China, like that was something that the left used to make fun of him. If you go on YouTube and search for Donald Trump China, there's a clip of him saying China at like 50 different venues, and he maybe says China like 200 times.
China, 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 China.
But like the fact that that video went viral and was used successfully to make fun of him just shows you that like there's half the population in America, at least half the population in America at that time, who thought that the notion that China was going to be a threat to the United States was absurd. Like, the fact that Trump is out there talking about China all the time is just stupid, because why do we even need to worry about China? It's like, well, we do. And then when you go there and you learn about China 2025 and plans to completely reduce reliance on Western technology in key areas like semiconductor manufacturing and aviation, and a lot of that is done by, stealing American technology through technology transfers and hacking and things like that. Like when you dive into it, a lot of what he said was true with respect to, maybe that's not the right way to put it, because, Trump, the way that he phrases things, there's always something to say is untrue, just because he's, a hyperbolic sort of guy. Like everything he says has elements of distruth mixed in with it. But what he was conveying and the policies that were being put in place at an actual kind of level of detail by his cabinet and his team, there was good motivation for them. And I didn't realize that until living there. And so, I used to be kind of like a almond milk latte drinking liberal in San Francisco who, no matter what Trump said, it was always a lie, and therefore whatever he said, the opposite was true. Like seeing that was not the case with China, because I lived there and experienced life there and kind of got a sense for what the general view towards America was there. I guess it sort of opened my mind to the possibility that, like, well, maybe it's not just China, maybe it's certain other assumptions that I've held to be the gospel for my entire life. Just challenging those other assumptions. I think, China kind of opened the door to that for me. Being a centrist today is never fashionable, right? Because you're not on team A or team B, so you're always going to get criticized by both. But whatever, if that's the price of like having your own thoughts, then that's okay. But yeah, I do think there's something to be said for the fact that Trump is the first president that like I can think of that openly opposed, the expansionism, the harm economically that like China under the Communist Party has inflicted on the US. And so I think that there's a lot of people who see that and think like, thank God that there's somebody who's finally trying to peel the wool back from the population's eyes about this threat that we've been trying to warn people about ever since we escaped China. But nobody listens to us, because the most important thing to the politicians here is to be able to uphold a trade deal and to do more business and to sell them more Coca-Cola, even if it means that there's people in concentration camps or, people being unable to practice religion or, everything that, like, these aren't secrets, right? These aren't secrets. It's just that people don't give sufficient weight to them or pay sufficient attention to them that it actually changes the policy of the US government. And so, yeah, I think just to an extent, his kind of aggressive stance on China, not just words, right? Not just words, but actually in terms of trade war policy and things like that are a breath of fresh air. And so, Biden so far has said a lot of the right things in terms of like condemning the repression in Hong Kong and condemning the threats over Taiwan and condemning what's happening in Xinjiang. Yeah, but I have a really hard time thinking that Bill Clinton wasn't also criticizing some of the like more egregious human rights abuses in China. It used to be fashionable to wear a T-shirt that said "Free Tibet" in the United States. Like when I was in high school, that was fashionable. So it's not to say that there hasn't been, just enough criticism of China to get some people to pay attention, but it's never been the sort of thing where there's actually any action behind it. The dollar rules everything at the end of the day. Money rules everything. And so, Biden's going to be under a lot of pressure to roll back some of the policies that made it harder for Western companies to make money in China, because that's how politics works. my vote doesn't count nearly as much as some corporation's $2 million donation to a super PAC. So I'll recommend two books that I've read recently that I think are good. Certainly they have an angle, but I think they have like less of a political angle than almost anything else I've read so far. One of them being The Perfect Dictatorship. So I think that book is pretty descriptive and gives you an idea of what the government's intentions are when they say things like opening up, what it does actually mean, because it doesn't mean opening up in the sense that we think of opening up. Opening up in a way that's beneficial to China financially, et cetera, without having to give up any control over the populace. So I think that's a great book. And then I think The 100-Year Marathon by Michael Pillsbury is also a good book. It's not a book that's meant to scare you as much as it is that like it might wake you up a little bit. And then, like if you're going to watch YouTube videos from one channel, then watch YouTube videos from another channel. If you're going to follow some of the more pro-Trump activists on Twitter, then, follow some of the more anti-Trump Chinese activists on Twitter, because both of them have valid points. And so like one of the really funny things is that every week there's probably somebody who accuses me of having sold my account either to the CCP or having sold my account to some kind of Trump propaganda outfit, because I don't necessarily fit very easily into one side or the other. I mean, there's certain policies that I'm in favor of and certain policies that I'm against, but I don't neatly fit into 100% of the time tweeting one thing or tweeting the other thing. And so if I ever say something that's maybe the CCP is bad if you look at the higher ups and what direction they're taking the country in, but if you want to say that every single one of the 90 million CCP members is evil and they're all evil incarnate, that's just not an accurate statement. So I'll say something like that, and then 会有一大堆网友说啊，你看这个人就早就把他的这个账号卖掉了。No, I mean, if you're not going to be realistic about the world, then you can't really. I don't know. I mean, it's certainly easier to convince yourself that everything about the other person is evil and everything about your side is good, but I don't ever find that to be a very interesting or accurate representation of how the world actually works. So if you follow me on Twitter, I'm Kevin on China, and then I have a Substack account called Kevin on China as well. So I haven't been writing as much recently because work has just been honestly 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But when I get the chance, I'll publish an essay maybe once a month or something, just about either my experience on China or kind of my view on current affairs.